Why we communicate: physical needs, identity needs, social needs, and practical goals. In hopping to identity needs, we learn about ourselves through the interaction of other people. In a sense, we decide who we are based on how people react to us. Social needs, besides helping to define who we are, communicators provide a vital link with others. Researchers and theorists have identified a whole range of social needs that we satisfy by communicating. These include pleasure, affection, companionship, escape, relaxation, and control. Practical goals. Besides satisfying social needs and shaping our identity, communication is most widely used approach in satisfying what communicating scholars call instrumental goals. That is, getting others to behave in ways that we want. Some instrumental goals are quite basic. Communication is a tool that lets you tell your hairstylist just a little off the sides, lets you negotiate at household duties, and lets you convince the plumber that the pipe is broken and needs attention right now. The transactional communication model updates and expands from the linear model to better capture communication as a uniquely human process. Some concepts and terms from the linear model are retained for the transactional model, whereas others are enhanced, added, or even eliminated. A few of the key players in the transactional model include communicators, environments, channels, internal and external noise. The transactional model uses the word communicator instead of sender and receiver. This term reflects the fact that people typically send and receive messages simultaneously and not in an unidirectional or back and forth manner as suggested in the linear model. A transactional model also shows that communicators often occupy different environments. That is, fields of experience that affect how they understand others' behavior. In communication terminology, environment refers not only to the physical location, but also to the personal experiences and cultural background that the participants bring into a conversation. The transactional model also retains the concept of noise, but with a broader focus. In the linear model, the focus is on noise in the channel and what is also known as external noise. For instance, loud music or too much cigarette smoke in a crowded room might be able to make it difficult for you to pay attention to the other person. The transactional model shows that noise also resides within communicators. This includes the physiological noise, which involves biological factors that interfere with accurate reception, such as illness, fatigue, hearing loss, and so on. Communicators can also encounter psychological noise, forces within that interfere with the ability to understand a message accurately. So the three types of noises that we look at here in the transactional model are external noise, physiological noise, and psychological noise. The transactional communication model isn't something that we do to others, rather it is an activity that we do with them. Interpersonal communication is a transactional process involving participants who occupy different but overlapping environments and create meaning in relationships through the exchange of messages, many of which are affected by external, physiological, and psychological noise. A quantitative definition of interpersonal communication involves any interaction between two people, usually face-to-face. Social scientists call the two interacting people a dyad, and they often use the adjectives dyadic to describe this type of communication. The impersonal nature of some two-person exchanges and personal nature of others have led scholars to argue that quality, not quantity, is what distinguishes interpersonal communication. Talking a qualitative approach, interpersonal communication occurs when people treat one another as unique individuals, regardless of the context in which the interaction occurs or the number of people involved. When quality of interaction is the criterion, the opposite of interpersonal communication is impersonal communication, not group, public, or mass communication. Several features distinguish qualitatively impersonal communication from less personal communication. The first feature is uniqueness. Communication in impersonal exchanges is determined by social rules, such as laughing politely at other people's jokes, don't dominate a conversation, and by social roles. The customer is always right. Be especially polite to senior citizens. Qualitatively, interpersonal relationships are characterized by the development of unique rules and roles. For example, in one relationship, you might exchange good-natured insults, whereas in another, you are careful never to offend your partner. Likewise, you might handle conflicts with one friend or family member by expressing disagreements as soon as they arise, whereas the unwritten rule in another relationship is to withhold resentments until they build up and then clear the air periodically. Communication scholars use the term relational culture to describe people in close relationships who create their own unique ways of interacting. A second feature of qualitatively interpersonal relationship is irreplaceability. Because interpersonal relationships are unique, they have no substitute. This explains why we usually feel so sad when a close friendship or love affair cools down. We know that no matter how many other relationships fill our lives, none of them will ever quite be like the one that just ended. Interdependence is the third feature of qualitatively interpersonal relationships. At the most basic level, the fate of the partners is connected. You might be able to brush off the anger, affection, excitement, or depression of someone you're not involved with personally, but in an interpersonal relationship, the other's lives affects you. The fourth feature of interpersonal relationship is often, though not always, the amount of disclosure of personal information. In impersonal relationships, we don't reveal that much about ourselves, but in interpersonal relationships, we feel more comfortable sharing our thoughts and feelings. The fifth feature of interpersonal communication is intrinsic rewards. In impersonal communication, we seek payoffs that have little to do with the people involved. You listen to instructors in class or talk to potential buyers of your used car in order to reach goals that usually have little to do with developing personal relationships. By contrast, you spend time qualitatively interpersonal relationships with friends, lovers, and others because you find the time personally rewarding. It often doesn't matter what you talk about. The relationship itself is what's most important. So most relationships are either interpersonal or impersonal. Rather, they fall somewhere on a continuum between these two extremes. Communication principles. Communication can be intentional or unintentional. Some communication is clearly intentional. You probably plan your words carefully before asking the boss for a raise or offering constructive criticism. Suppose, for instance, that a friend overhears you muttering complaints to yourself. Even though you did not intend for her to hear your remarks, they certainly did carry a message. In addition to these slips of the tongue, we unintentionally send many nonverbal messages. You might not be aware of your sour expression, impatient shifting, or sigh boredom, but others view them nonetheless. It is impossible not to communicate. Whatever you do, whether you speak or remain silent, confront or avoid, act emotional or keep a poker face, you provide information to others about your thoughts and feelings. In this sense, we are like transmitters that can't be shut off. Communication is unrepeatable. Because communication is an ongoing process, it is impossible to repeat the same event. That friendly smile that worked so well when meeting a stranger last week might not succeed with the person you meet tomorrow. Why? Because neither you nor the other person is the same person. You've lived longer. Your feelings about each other may have changed. You need not constantly invent new ways to act around familiar people, but you should realize that at the same time they are spoken or performed. Communication is irreversible. We sometimes wish that we could back up in time, erase words or acts, and replacing them with better alternatives. Other times, no amount of explanation can erase the impression you've created. Once you hit the send button, they can't take it back. Words said, messages sent, and deeds are done are irretrievable. Communication has a content and relational dimension. Practically all exchange operate on two levels. The content dimension involves information explicitly discussed. Turn left at the next corner. You can buy that less for online. In addition to this sort of obvious content, messages also have relational dimensions that express how you feel about the other person, whether you like or dislike the other person, feel in control or subordinate, feel comfortable or anxious, and so on. For instance, consider how many different relational messages you could communicate by simply saying, "I'm busy tonight, but maybe some other time," in so many different ways. The relational dimension of a message is more important than the content under discussion. So consider when a customer service rep has spoken to you in a tone that seemed dismissive or rude. This explains why arguments develop apparently trivial subjects such as whose turn is it to wash the dishes or how to spend the weekend. In cases like this, that's really being tested is the nature of the relationship. Who's in control? How important are we to each other? There are many communication misconceptions out there. For example, more communication is not always better. Sometimes excessive communication is simply unproductive, as when two people talk a problem to death, going over the same ground again and again without making progress. As one communication book puts it, more and more negative communication merely leads to more and more negative results. Pestering a prospective employer after your job interview or texting too many call me messages can generate the opposite reaction from what you are seeking. Meanings are not in words. The biggest mistake we can make is to assume that saying something is the same thing as communicating it. The words that make perfect sense to you can be perceived and interpreted entirely different ways by others. Successful communication doesn't always involve shared understanding. For example, we are often deliberately vague in order to spare another person's feelings. Now imagine how you might reply to a friend that asks, "What do you think about my new tattoo?" You might tactfully say, "Wow, that's really unusual," instead of honestly and clearly answering, "I think that's grotesque." In other words, more satisfying relationships can sometimes come from less than perfect understanding. And communication will not solve all problems. Imagine, for example, that you ask an instructor to explain why you received a poor grade on a project that you believe deserved top marks. The instructor clearly outlines the reasons why you received the poor grade and sticks to that position after listening thoughtfully to your protests. Has the communication solved the problem? Hardly. Communication competence isn't as easy as it might seem. Although scholars struggle to agree on the precise definition, most would agree that competent communication involves achieving one's goal in a manner that, in most cases, maintains or enhances the relationship in which it occurs. Put another way, competence seeks to be both effective and appropriate. Effective and appropriate. The following characteristics typify a competent communicator. 1. There is no ideal way to communicate. Your own experiences show that a variety of communication styles can be effective. Some very successful communicators are serious, whereas others use humor. Some are gregarious, whereas others are quieter. And some are more straightforward, whereas others hint diplomatically. Just as there are many kinds of beautiful music or art, there are many kinds of competent communication. Competence is situational. Even within a culture or relationship, the specific communication that is competent in one setting might be a big mistake in another. The joking insults you routinely trade with one friend might offend a sensitive family member. And last Saturday night's romantic approach would most likely be out of place at work on Monday morning. Because competent behavior varies so much from one situation and person to another, it's a mistake to think that competent communication is a trait that a person either has or does not have. Competence can be learned. To some degree, biology is destiny when it comes to communication styles. Studies of identical and fraternal twins suggest that traits including sociability, anger, and relaxation seem to be partly a function of our genetic makeup. Fortunately, biology isn't the only factor that shapes how we communicate. Communication competence is, to a great degree, a set of skills that anyone can learn. Skills trainings have been shown to help communicators in a variety of professional fields. So what makes an effective communicator? Here are a few characteristics of effective communicators. 1. They have a wide range of behaviors. 2. They have the ability to choose the most appropriate behavior. Although it's impossible to say precisely how to act in every situation, you should consider at least 3 factors when choosing a response. The first factor in communication is context. Time and place will almost always influence how you act. Next is your goal. Your goal will also shape the approach you take. Inviting a new neighbor over for a cup of coffee or dinner could be just the right approach if you want to encourage a friendship. But if you want to maintain your privacy, it might be wiser to be polite but cool. Finally, your knowledge of the other person should shape the approach you take. So if you're dealing with someone who is very sensitive or insecure, your response might be supportive and cautious. With an old and trusted friend, you might be blunt. So after you've chosen the most appropriate way to communicate, it's still necessary to perform the required skills effectively. There's a big difference between knowing about a skill and being able to put that skill into practice. Simply being aware of alternatives isn't much help unless you can skillfully put these alternatives to work. Social scientists use the term cognitive complexity to describe the ability to construct a variety of frameworks for viewing an issue. To understand how cognitive complexity can increase competence, imagine that a longtime friend seems to be angry with you. One possible explanation is that your friend is offended by something you've done. Another possibility is that something has happened in another part of your friend's life that is upsetting. Considering the issues from several angles might prevent you from overreacting or misunderstanding the situation, increasing the odds of finding a way to resolve the problem constructively. Empathy involves feeling and experiencing another person's situation almost as they do. The ability is so important that some researchers have labeled empathy as the most important aspect of communication competence. Psychologists use the term self-monitoring to describe the process of paying close attention to one's behavior and using these observations to shape the way one behaves. Self-monitors are able to separate a part of their consciousness and observe their behaviors from a detached point of view, making observations such as, "I'm making a fool of myself. I better speak up now. This approach is working well. I'll keep it up." One of the features that distinguishes effective communication, at least qualitatively, interpersonal relationships, is commitment. In other words, people who seem to care about their relationships communicate better than those who don't. This care shows up in at least two ways. The first is commitment to the other person. Concern for the other person is revealed in a variety of ways. A desire to spend time with him or her instead of rushing off. A willingness to listen carefully instead of doing all the talking, and the use of language that makes sense to the other person, and openness to change after hearing the other person's ideas. Effective communicators also care about the message. They appear sincere, seem to know what they are talking about, and demonstrate through words and deeds that they care about what they say.